hospital room in Cleveland, Ohio, October 1984. A 16-year-old boy lies in bed, his body failing after a lifelong fight with cystic fibrosis. Standing beside him are four of the most famous musicians in America. They are not performing for 20,000 people tonight. They are performing for one. In his hands, Steve Perry holds a Walkman. Inside it is a cassette that no one outside the band has ever heard. Not a fan, not a critic, not a radio programmer. The first human being on Earth to hear Journey's new song will be a dying teenager named Kenny Sykaluk. Perry presses play, the boy listens, and somewhere in that room, a song called Only the Young stops being a leftover studio track and becomes something else entirely. If these hidden stories move you, subscribe to RetroWaves for more. To understand why this moment carried so much weight, it helps to understand where Journey stood in the fall of 1984. This was not a struggling band looking for a comeback. This was a band at the absolute peak of American rock radio. Don't Stop Believin' had already become one of the most played songs in the country. Open Arms had proven the band could soften its sound into something built for slow dances and heartbreak alike. Steve Perry's voice, that unmistakable high tenor, had become one of the defining instruments of the era. Guitarist Neil Schon supplied the technical fire that had powered the band since its earliest days as a jazz fusion outfit in the 1970s. Keyboardist Jonathan Cain, who had joined in 1980 after leaving the Babies, brought a songwriter's instinct for hooks built to fill stadiums. Journey had not arrived at that position easily. The band's original lineup, formed in San Francisco in 1973 out of the remnants of Santana's touring group, played instrumental, progressive rock to modest audiences who valued musicianship over hooks. Early Journey albums sold respectably, but did not chart the band as a major commercial force. It was only after Perry joined as lead vocalist in 1977, brought in partway through the recording of what would become the album Infinity, that the band began shifting toward the melodic, hook-driven sound that would eventually define them. Perry's arrival changed everything about how the band was heard, and by extension, how it was marketed and sold. Where the early lineup had chased musicianship for its own sake, the Perry-era band chased something considerably harder to manufacture: emotional accessibility at a massive scale. Songs that could play in a car, at a wedding, in an arena, and still feel personal to whoever happened to be listening. Jonathan Cain's path to the band followed a similar arc of steady, hard-won progress, rather than overnight success. Before joining Journey in 1980, Cain had spent years in working bands, including a stint with the Babies, building a reputation as a songwriter capable of writing directly to an audience's emotions rather than around them. His arrival coincided with Journey's push toward even more accessible songwriting, a shift that would produce the run of albums, including Escape and Frontiers, that turned the band from a successful touring act into one of the defining commercial forces of American rock radio. By the early 1980s, that formula had made Journey one of the biggest touring acts in America. But success on that scale came at a cost that rarely showed up in the record sales. The band operated at a punishing pace: constant touring, constant recording, constant pressure to top the last album. The 1983 record Frontiers had been a commercial success, reaching number 2 on the Billboard album chart, but it had also been a difficult record to make. Songs were written, recorded, and discarded in the search for the right sequence and sound. One of those discarded tracks was a mid-tempo anthem called Only the Young. According to the song's own history, it didn't fit the direction the band wanted for Frontiers, and it was pulled from the album within days of being recorded, in favor of other songs that made the final cut. That left Only the Young in an unusual position for a song from a band this successful, finished, professionally recorded, and going nowhere. It sat on a shelf while the band moved forward with other material and another grueling tour cycle. Nobody involved in making it could have guessed that its first real audience would not be a stadium crowd chanting the chorus back at the stage, but a single teenager in a hospital bed 400 miles from Journey's world of arenas and tour buses. Kenny Sykaluk lived in Rocky River, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland. He had cystic fibrosis, a genetic disease that slowly destroys the lungs and digestive system, making ordinary breathing progressively harder over the course of a lifetime. In 1984, treatment for the condition was far more limited than it is today, and a diagnosis in childhood often meant a significantly shortened life expectancy. By that autumn, Kenny's condition had become terminal. He was 16 years old, and by every account, he was a devoted fan of Journey specifically, not just of rock music in general. His mother wrote a letter, not to a record label, not to a publicist chasing a feel-good story, but a direct appeal describing her son's condition and how much the band's music meant to him. The request reached the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which arranged for Journey to visit Kenny at the cystic fibrosis clinic where he was being treated in Cleveland. At the time, cystic fibrosis carried a far grimmer prognosis than it does today. Median life expectancy for patients diagnosed in the early 1980s was measured in years, not decades, and the disease's progression, gradually filling the lungs with thick mucus and making every breath a labor, was well understood by families like Kenny's, even if it remained obscure to the wider public. For a touring rock band operating on a schedule built around album cycles and stadium dates, agreeing to a hospital visit for a single fan meant carving time out of a machine that rarely stopped moving. Journey made that time. This is the part of the story that separates a routine celebrity visit from what actually happened next. The band did not simply show up, sign a poster, and pose for a photograph before moving on to sound check. They brought gifts, chosen with real thought. A football helmet autographed by the San Francisco 49ers, and an autographed Platinum Record Award recognizing the band's own commercial success. And they brought something no fan, no journalist, and no radio programmer anywhere in the country had access to. Steve Perry brought a Walkman loaded with a cassette of Only the Young, the song still sitting completely unreleased and unheard outside the band's own inner circle. Kenny Sykaluk became the first person outside the band to hear it. Not a producer, not a record executive, not a critic weighing in on whether the song would be a hit. A 16-year-old boy, running out of time, hearing an anthem about youth and possibility that the band itself had almost thrown away. Consider what that decision actually meant in practical terms. Only the Young was, at that point, a completed studio recording with genuine commercial potential, the kind of asset a band and its label would normally guard closely until an official release could be planned and promoted. Letting it leak, even to a single listener, ran counter to how the music industry typically protected unreleased material. Journey did it anyway, for an audience that would never review the song, never buy the single, and never tell another living soul what they thought of it, because the only person who mattered in that room was a boy who might not live to hear it any other way. According to accounts the band has given in the years since, including Jonathan Cain's retelling on VH1's Behind the Music, the visit was not a brief, staged appearance designed to generate goodwill. They stayed. They talked with him. They watched him listen to a song written by strangers who, in that room, stopped being strangers at all. What happened to Steve Perry after he left that room is documented in his own words, given in later interviews rather than manufactured for the moment itself. "As soon as I walked out of the hospital room, I lost it," Perry has said. "Nurses had to take me to a room by myself. A man who had performed in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans without visibly flinching came undone in a hospital hallway, out of sight of everyone but the staff who had to guide him somewhere private. Jonathan Cain has spoken about the visit with similar weight. On Behind the Music, he broke down recalling it, saying that children should not have to live with that kind of pain. For a keyboardist known for co-writing some of the era's most optimistic rock anthems, songs built to reassure and uplift, the memory of Kenny Sykaluk clearly cut through any professional distance the band might normally maintain in interviews about their own success. Kenny died the next day. According to the accounts that have circulated since, the Walkman was still in his hand. For a band that had spent years chasing bigger arenas and bigger sales figures, this was a different kind of ending entirely. There was no encore, no chart position to check the following week, no review to read the next morning. There was only a boy who did not live long enough to hear "Only the Young" played on the radio, like everyone else eventually would, and 4 musicians who now carried a memory that no amount of commercial success could match, explain, or replace. It is worth pausing here on what separates this account from the kind of vague, second-hand celebrity anecdote that circulates without real sourcing. Every detail central to this story traces back to the band members themselves, speaking on the record, in named interviews and a nationally broadcast documentary, rather than to anonymous rumor or embellished fan retelling. Perry's account of losing composure in the hallway is his own quote. Cain's emotional recollection is his own, delivered on camera. The gifts brought to the hospital, the football helmet, the platinum record, the Walkman itself, are consistently corroborated across multiple retellings by people who were present. Where the record becomes less certain, such as exactly how word of the Walkman still being in Kenny's hand first reached the public, this account treats that detail as reported rather than independently confirmed. What makes this story more than a sad footnote in a larger career is what it did to the song itself, and by extension, to how the band understood the rest of their catalog going forward. Only the Young was eventually rescued from the shelf where it had been sitting since being cut from Frontiers. It was placed on the soundtrack of the 1985 film Vision Quest and released as a single, where it reached the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100 in March of that year. On paper, that is simply a commercial comeback for a track that had once been discarded during an album sequencing decision. But for the members of Journey who had stood in that hospital room, the song's eventual success could never again be separated from Kenny Sykaluk. Neil Schon has said that Kenny's death affected the band by pushing them to reevaluate the tensions that had been building inside the group. This is worth stating carefully, because it would be easy to overstate the connection. Journey's internal friction in the mid-1980s had many sources, from creative disagreements over the band's direction to the sheer exhaustion of years spent constantly on the road. The band would not officially break up until 1987, and that breakup involved far more than any single event. But Sean's own account links this particular loss to a broader reckoning about what the band was actually doing, and who all of it was ultimately for. A song about the hope and possibility of youth had become, almost overnight, a song forever tied to a young life that had run out of time before it truly began. The band chose to honor that connection publicly, in the most fitting way a touring rock band could. When Journey launched their Raised on Radio tour, they opened concerts with Only the Young, reportedly in tribute to Kenny Sykaluk. Night after night, in front of audiences who had no idea of the story behind the opening notes, the band began their show with a song that had first been played, quietly and privately, for a dying teenager who would never see a Journey concert of his own. There is a version of this story that could easily slide into manufactured sentimentality, the kind of tearjerker moment record labels sometimes engineer for publicity purposes. But the documented details resist that reading. Nobody arranged a press event around the hospital visit. There was no film crew capturing Perry's reaction in the hallway afterward. The account of his breakdown comes from his own later interviews, not from a publicist's press release issued at the time it happened. The story surfaced gradually, through the band members choosing, years afterward, to talk publicly about what that day had actually meant to them. Most notably, in the VH1 Behind the Music episode that introduced the story to a wider audience nearly a decade after it happened. That delay between the event itself and the public telling of it is worth sitting with. For years, the only people who knew the full weight of what happened in that hospital room were the 4 members of the band, Kenny's family, and the hospital staff who witnessed it. The song reached the top 10 without most of its listeners ever knowing where its first performance had taken place. Fans danced to it, drove to it, and eventually walked down aisles to it, entirely unaware that its earliest audience had been a single dying teenager holding a Walkman instead of a lighter. That distinction matters, because it changes what the song carries for anyone who learns the full context. Only the Young is, on its surface, an arena rock anthem built for a stadium crowd. Complete with the kind of soaring chorus Journey had built an entire career on delivering. But its actual first listener was not a crowd of thousands with lighters raised. He was one boy, in one bed, running out of time, holding a cassette player instead. For Steve Perry specifically, the encounter with Kenny Sykaluk sits alongside a broader pattern that would come to define much of his life after Journey. Years later, following the loss of his girlfriend Kelly Nash to cancer, Perry would speak again about grief and about music as a way of processing loss too large for ordinary words to hold. The hospital room in Cleveland stands, in that sense, as an early and formative experience with a truth that would keep resurfacing throughout his career, that the songs audiences remember as triumphant, radio-ready hits are often built on private losses the audience itself never sees or hears about. The band's decision to keep opening shows with Only the Young throughout the Raised on Radio tour is its own quiet statement, made without a single word of explanation from the stage. They did not turn Kenny's story into a spoken tribute for the crowd each night, did not announce his name before the first note. They simply let the song do what it had always done for its very first listener in a hospital bed, carry something honest into a room full of strangers, whether that room held one dying fan or 20,000 paying ones. What remains striking about this story, decades later, is how ordinary its beginning actually was. A mother writing a letter out of desperation and love. A charity connecting a dying boy with the band he cared about most. A visit that could easily have amounted to 15 minutes of photographs and small talk before the band moved on to their next commitment. Instead, it became the first performance, in any form, of a song that would go on to reach millions of listeners who never knew its origin, its near cancellation, or the boy who heard it before any of them. Every artist working at that level eventually confronts the gap between the size of their audience and the size of any single human life. Journey, at the height of their commercial power, found that gap collapse into a single hospital room, for a single fan, on a single day, in October of 1984. The song that resulted did not become famous because of that visit. It was already written, already recorded, and already destined for a soundtrack placement and a chart run with or without Kenny Sykaluk ever hearing it. But its meaning to the people who made it, and eventually to the people who now tell its story decades later, was permanently changed by a 16-year-old boy who heard it first, and who did not live long enough to hear it again. That is the part of Only the Young that never made it onto the singles label, never appeared in the liner notes, and was never announced from a stage during the tour that opened with it night after night. It exists instead in the space between a verified fact and a private memory, a Walkman held by a dying teenager, a singer who had to be led into a room alone in order to fall apart, and a band that spent the rest of a difficult decade quietly carrying a story most of their fans still don't know. Kenny Sykaluk's grave in Ohio has, according to accounts that circulate among cystic fibrosis patients and their families online, become a small point of reference for people who know the story, a reminder that a chart hit most people associate with driving songs and wedding playlists began somewhere far more private. The exact details of how widely that memory has spread cannot be independently verified beyond the scattered tributes and forum posts that reference it, and this account should be understood as reported recollection rather than confirmed record. What can be confirmed is the timeline itself, the letter, the visit, the Walkman, the death the following day, and the words Perry and Cain have since chosen to use when asked about it. Rock and roll built its mythology on excess, sold-out tours, platinum plaques, and voices powerful enough to fill stadiums without a single microphone failing. Kenny Sykaluk's story sits outside that mythology entirely. It offers no lesson about ambition or fame. It offers only the image of a band, at the absolute height of its commercial power, choosing to spend one of its most private and personal songs on an audience of exactly one. Everything, only the young, became afterward. The chart position, the soundtrack placement, the nightly tour opener, was built on top of a performance nobody outside that hospital room was ever meant to hear.